do just like a couple minutes of meditation first on the breath, just to bring ourselves into the present moment. So you bring your attention to the present moment, sensations of the breath. As you breathe in, you're aware of the sensations breathing in. As you breathe out, you're aware of the sensations of breathing out. Whenever thoughts or feelings arise, you notice them and gently bring your attention back to the breath. So while we're in a meditative mode, a little more in the present moment, we'll also just take a few minutes to cultivate our motivation. Let's begin with compassion for ourselves. Recognize, first of all, compassion is the wish to free someone from suffering. So we feel my purpose in being here, this class, my purpose today in general. is to free myself from suffering. So one actually kind of empathizes with one's own suffering in the future. He cultivates a wish, a loving, compassionate wish to practice the path, Dharma, in order to free oneself from suffering. I want happiness, but don't always have it. So we're saying Buddhism, I never have actually uncontaminated happiness. Happiness is always just temporary, brief moments. But with compassion, one wants to free oneself from gross suffering, but even the subtle kinds of suffering of samsaric existence. The sufferings of insecurity, the sufferings of never being satisfied truly, the sufferings of not being in control of one's own mind and future, the suffering of being under the control of ignorance and afflictive emotions, and the karmic actions that they motivate. And with that awareness, we expand our compassion out. So we recognize I'm not unique in that. Everyone suffers. Everyone is controlled by ignorance, mental afflictions, self-centeredness, confusion. Everyone has gross suffering of sickness, pain, loss. Everyone has all kinds of subtle suffering, of mental agitation, dissatisfaction, kind of being trapped in self-centeredness and trapped in self-grasping, without any choice, giving rise to all kinds of afflictive emotions, doing karmic actions, and creating so much suffering for themselves and each other, just as I do. Really expand our compassion. So I and others are totally the same in these ways. So my purpose today, my purpose for this class, my purpose for this day, is compassion that embraces all sentient beings who suffer, wishing to liberate myself and others from suffering. And with loving kindness, wishing to lead all beings to happiness. Others' happiness and well-being depends on me. My happiness and well-being depends upon others. We're totally interdependent. So my motivation is love and compassion. And ultimately it comes down, right, to my motivation is bodhicitta, the compassionate wish to become enlightened for the welfare of all sentient beings. With that kind of love and compassion in our hearts, I'll recite the verse of refuge and bodhicitta for those who know it. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So then we're returning to Lama Tsongkhapa's text, the middle-length Lamrim, or middle-length stages of the path to enlightenment. And for those who are actually following in the text, some of you have it, we're up to page 258. But I just want to remind people where we're at right now. So we're in the kind of longest section of the text, the final, and also it's also the last big section of the text, which is how to, they call it special insight, or another way, Lama Tsongkhapa calls it special insight, right? Or another way to say it is, right, he's teaching here on how to meditate on emptiness, the ultimate nature of reality. And we're in a section, we left off about 3/4 of the way through, a section on how to meditate on the emptiness of yourself, right, of the personal I, or self. And we're on the fourth point, but I just want to remind everyone, it's a little strange to jump into the fourth point without remembering what the first three were. So I'll just briefly say them, right? So, and it's going to be important because he's going to get into a lot of details about this, right? So there are 4 points that he's giving here for this particular, there are various ways to meditate on the emptiness of the self, but the main one he's teaching here is this. It begins, so there are 4 points. The first one is identifying the object of negation. So emptiness means empty of something, right? Emptiness, as he says very clearly, doesn't just mean blankness or nothing, right? Or an empty mind. It's not that. So we're meditating in a very precise way on that a particular thing doesn't exist, right? That's the object of negation. And so the first step is experientially in yourself identifying what you're refuting, right? What you're negating, which is a particular kind of object of ignorance, right? And he points out, he points out, it's the most subtle one. Right? So a grasping at a sense of self that exists, you could say, independently, or exists by its own nature, or exists from its own side, exists as something more than merely labeled by the mind. Then the second step is what they call the Probation. This is logic, right? I went through this, so I'm not going to go into detail again. But it's a term from Buddhist logic teachings, which means, and in this case, it's that if such a self exists, then it must exist as a singular thing or as a multiple, as plural. All things must exist as singular or plural if they truly exist. Right? So he says, and there's not a third option. That's the Probation. Then the third step was that it's not one, right? So that the self and the aggregates, the body and mind constituents, are not one. That's what we covered last class. So anyway, now we're up to the fourth section, which we'll go into detail, which is that the self and the aggregates, right? The aggregates being the mind-body complex, are not different, are not inherently different. And so that's what he says here on page 258. The outline says, the fourth essential point, refuting that the self and the aggregates are inherently different. So that's what we're up to now. It's near the bottom of the page. And I'll actually read this part here. He says, but what fault is there if you assert that the two, the self and the aggregates, to be inherently different? And then he quotes Negardana, who says, the root text on wisdom, which says, if it were other than the aggregates, it would not have their characteristics. And he goes on to explain, in this regard, if the self were different from the aggregates, so established by way of its own entity, it would not have the characteristics that characterize the aggregates as compounded phenomena: production, disintegration, abidance. And then he says it would be like a horse, for example, that does not have the characteristics of an ox, because it is established as an object other than an ox. So what's he saying here? Let's talk about it. And he's going to make various points about this, refuting the idea that the self is different from the aggregates. So one point is, if the self were inherently existed and were other than the aggregates, it would have to be, let's see, say it right, unrelated to them. Does that make sense? If something's inherently existent and separate, if two things are inherently existent and separate, then they can't be related. And so there are a number of points he's making here. The first one is, if you think about yourself, right? And this is, again, remember what he said earlier in terms of the object of negation. The self is what we grasp at our whole life, right? And so you say, I want this, I want that, I did this, I went here, I went there. That's what we're talking. We're not talking about some esoteric thing here. We're talking about the self that we experience, and that, what's that we say, right? That we would kill somebody else to defend, right? And that we would steal from somebody sometimes, or cheat somebody to get something, right? And so he's saying, if that self inherently exists apart from your body and mind, then what do you mean by I went somewhere? Well, your body went there. What do you mean by I want something? Well, your mind wants something, right? What do you mean by they insulted me, right? Somebody insults you and you feel so upset, right? That you should, even if somebody just says the littlest thing, your mind can get so upset, right? And so what he's saying here is, well, who did they insult? First of all, somebody other, not in other words, it was they were looking at your body and they said something about either your body or mind, right? They said you're ugly, or they said you're stupid. Right? Well, one is insulting your body, the other is insulting your mind. They didn't insult something unrelated to your body and mind, right? Then he says also it wouldn't have, what do you say? Arising, abidance, and disintegration, right? Well, that self, right? We say I was born in such and such year, in such and such place, by my parents or this. Your whole sense of identity, right? It arose, it abides for your life, and then that particular person dies, right? Whereas in Buddhism, your mental continuum continues, but that person that you are dies at the time of death, right? So there's an arising, abiding, and ceasing of this particular sense of self, and he's saying, if it weren't related to the body and mind, you wouldn't have that, right? So he's pointing out contradictions to your own experience. Does that make sense? He goes on to say, actually, I'm going to say a little more from here first. So he says, okay, so there's another point here he's getting about uncompounded, and I want to kind of explain this point. Another point he's saying is, if you're meditating like this, right, you would have to say, what he was saying, it would have to be, self-established. Does that make sense? If the self existed apart from the aggregates, it would have to be self-established or existent from its own side as something that's not the aggregates, not your body and mind, right? And so in his commentary, Probation, in his commentary to this says, so when you're meditating on that, one way of doing it is you would have to look. So if you took away, right, so you take away your body, and then you take away your feelings, your discrimination, right, your emotions, your thoughts, your consciousness itself. Right? And then Probation says, and then you should be able to find something there that's yourself, that exists totally independent of those. But if you search in meditation, you'll never find such a thing. That's another way of saying this, right? Because in other words, if the self exists as something separate from the aggregates, then you have to be able, it should be findable as something separate from the aggregates. His own Lama often points this out. He says, and he actually says, if it's truly existent in that way, then the more you search and look for it, the more clearly it should appear to your mind. Right? And that's what his Holiness often says. But then Probation and his Holiness point out, but when you search for it in this way, actually you don't find anything at all, right? Nothing appears clearly. As you search for that thing, you can't find it, right? If you strip away all the gross, and also there are subtle, that's another point here that sometimes Kimi Kinsram she points out. Also, there are gross levels of the body and the mind, and then there is particularly in Tantra, right, in Tantric Buddhism, there are subtle levels, subtler and subtler levels of awareness, and also of physicality even. Right? And what he says is you can search those too. Right? You can search the most subtle levels of your consciousness. But even there, it's still, first of all, it's still mind, right? Even a subtle level of consciousness is still consciousness. So you're looking for something separate from those. That's the self. And what they're saying here is, and you don't find that. You don't find a self that exists apart from gross levels and subtle levels of body and mind. So that's contradicting that such a self exists. So there are various ways to get at this. One is, if you take away the various aspects of your body and mind to search for that self, you don't find it. Another way of getting at it, which is it doesn't arise, in other words, the self seems to arise, abide, and cease. But something that's unrelated to the body and mind wouldn't do that, right? It would be uncompounded. That's what he's saying here. That's why he says uncompounded. It would be some uncompounded thing that exists apart from them and unrelated to them. But there is no self like that. Then another point is, as you look at the self as you intuitively experience it in life, right? Again, as I was saying, the self that gets upset, the self that gets angry, the self that gets hungry, the self that wants to go somewhere, the self that is happy or sad or joyful or depressed or whatever, that self is related to the body and mind, right? You experience it that way. So it contradicts that the self exists independent of the body and mind. And then he says, so he's saying what I just said. He's saying, if it existed inherently different from the characteristics of the aggregates, such as form and so on, he's saying, it would have to be observed as such. And he's saying, but when you search, that's what I was just saying, when you search for something that would exist inherently different from those, you can't find it, so it's not observed as such. Then it said, and then he quotes again Nagarjuna. It is inadmissible for the self to be other than the appropriated, meaning the aggregates. If it were other, you could apprehend it in their absence, which you cannot. So that's what I was describing Bonker and Shaping out, right? You would have to be able to find it or see it if it existed in that way, if you search deeply, but you can never find a self that exists totally independent of the body and mind. And actually, as you search, what you find is that, is that we label self sometimes based on, as long as Lama often points this out, sometimes you label yourself based on your body. If you have to, because here you're analyzing your own experience. Does that make sense? So sometimes as you analyze it, you find that that you are grasping at a self that seems to be one with the body, right? So you say, oh, I'm in pain. Right? I'm in pain, meaning the body's in pain, right? So there's some identification. Other times you identify a self that seems to be identified with the mind, right? Like, I feel sad today, right? Then at that point, the self seems to be identified with the mind. Sometimes you say, oh, my arm hurts, right? Then there seems to be a self that's the owner of the aggregates, right? There are different ways that the self appears to you, but what he's saying here, and what Nagarjuna is pointing out, and Lama Tsongkhapa is pointing out, is that the self always appears as related in some way to the aggregates. There is no self that appears even, ever, as totally unrelated to them. And so it doesn't exist in that way. And so one never, the way they put it is that one never apprehends or sees a self, yourself, in the absence of the body and mind, right? And another way of saying this, like sometimes if you're just thinking about it, if you're contemplating it, right, like if I say, it's true about oneself, and it's also true of others, right? Like if I say, oh, there's John. I haven't seen you in a while, John. Nice to see you, right? One never does that in the absence of John's body or John's mind, right? Like there is, actually we would know that, right? If I turned here and said, hi, John, we actually would know as being psychotic, right? So when we apprehend a self, it's always in relation to. Does that make sense? One's own or somebody else in this case is body and mind. Yep.
So what about like a vision? People have visions and it's swear that person was there. Obviously, the aggregates aren't there.
But even the vision, what does it mean by a vision? Like,
I'm not real sure. That's why I'm trying to kind of like think about what does that mean. When I think I'm, Ashley's giving me the "you're crazy" sign, but but you know, like when people have had visions and like holy people and stuff, and it was theoretically at least told to be real. Was it real? Was it not real? Was this real? There's no aggregates, are there?
actually, I'll make me remember this. A couple weeks ago, I was listening to it's actually a talk. It was like a live stream talk by Professor Bob Thurman. He was actually at the FPMC Center in San Francisco, and he was very funny. He was talking actually about Lama Tsongkhapa's life, and he was saying this thing. He was saying that Lama. The reason I'm bringing it up is he was pointing out that it was probably when Lama Tsongkhapa wrote these texts and was meditating and retreat. He often had visions of the great masters of the past, and he would talk Manjushri, but also he would see like Atisha or Chandrakirti or Buddhapalita. They would all come to him in visions to like discuss Buddhism. But so then Bob Thurman said, because he said like because it was very funny. He said, because great Buddhist masters, when they die, they're like Jedi. They just like, he was like, like Obi-Wan had the body of light. And he was like, they're kind of like that, and I was like laughing. I was like, okay, Jedi, I don't know, it's kind of fun metaphor, I thought. Or fun, he was being funny, but his point was, what he was saying was that they have a body of, he was saying, they have a body of light. But that would be an aggregate. That would be a subtle, that's why I was saying they're gross, and they're, like in Buddhism, according to Tantric Buddhism, there are these subtle, we call it wind, actually. And that the great Buddhist masters can sort of, can control that and can use that in different ways. But the point being that even that is a subtle kind of aggregate. In other words, it's a subtle body. And then there's a consciousness associated with it. Otherwise, it's not a vision, so when he was having a vision of Atisha, right, he was having an appearance, and there was a conscious, if he was having, if it was a true vision, right, of Manjushri or something. The point being that according to that level of Buddhist teachings, a great being like that can appear in this subtle form, but it's still a subtle form. Is the point. So that's why I mentioned it could be gross. For people like me, it's always a gross level of, right. We see, like I never say, oh, there's Lisa, where it's just a light appearing to me. It's always
I'm just saying,
hair and eyes.
Me?
Yeah, you appear maybe that way, but my mind's too gross.
No wonder you don't say hi back.
I actually once had a conversation like that with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, where he said, I'll appear to you some way like that to tell you something, and I said, well, what if I can't see you? I said, I'd prefer an email. Rinpoche laughed, but yeah, no. So the idea is that it's still aggregates. Actually, that's the point. Really, is that it would be a subtler form of aggregates, but it's still aggregates. Yeah.
But if you only heard the voice of Lama Yeshe versus actually seeing Lama Yeshe, would that still be the aggregates if there was no physical there was no physical existence? It was just this voice coming from a corner.
Yeah, I mean, if some, I don't know, I've never had that experience, of course, but if something like that happened, you would say, actually, because sound, right? I mean, is still.
It's a wavelength, just like light.
Yeah, it still has a matter.
Actually, so the aggregates actually include sound only?
I guess the idea would be, well, I would put it this way, actually, like, if there's a sound that has a meaning, right, then it has to be coming from, actually, if you think about the nature of sound, right, sound comes, well, actually sound, so I'm hesitating, because at one point sound comes from matter, doesn't it? Actual sound. Like, even if it's a bell, you hit a bell, I mean, it's a wavelength that's affecting matter, isn't it, that affects our eardrum. So if you're literally hearing it, matter is involved, isn't it?
Well,
but also if it's words,
the wind can also create sound.
Oh, I see. So, but I guess the point is, if it's words, then there has to be consciousness, doesn't there? So then there's mind. Like if you believed it was Lama Yeshe, right? Actually, even if you say that, if I say, oh wow, if somebody had an auditory experience, right? Now, first of all, of course, it could be hallucination or something, or it could be, but let's assume you're
meditating and you actually believe you really heard Lama Yeshe talking to you.
So there again, though, I mean, if I focus on what this actual teaching is, right? When the person said, so let's say Lama Yeshe said some wise thing, right? You heard some wise phrase and you said, oh, that's Lama Yeshe. the point is actually not, actually the real point is this, is when if I were that person, right, and I'm grasping at the idea that was Lama Yeshe, right, actually in my own awareness, what I'm grasping at is mind, mostly, isn't it? And I'd be grasping at, because I don't see Lama Yeshe's body if I'm in this fictional example, but I would think, the person who had that would be thinking or feeling, wow, that was him, right? And when they think of him, they're probably grasping at the mind, actually.
And they're probably actually seeing him at the same time.
In their mind,
even if they didn't see him in the vision, you've already created a picture. I was just doing it right now, and I immediately thought of 3 or 4 different photographs of him when we were talking about it.
Yeah, so it's never, and so you prove the point that Lama Tsongkhapa is making, which is we never grasp at a self completely independent of that body and mind of that person. There's always some grasping at either, oh, he was so compassionate, right? Or he was so wise, or, oh, this is what he looked like in the picture. But there's always an association to the body or mind. Mm-hmm. That's the point, right? And so, same thing, if a person had, whether it was a voice, then one is grasping either at the image, like you said, from the photograph, or memory, or at the consciousness of that person. And the same thing with Lisa's case, right? If a person had a vision where they see Manjushri, they're grasping at that subtle form. If the person hears a voice, they're grasping at, it could be a mental image, or it could be an idea of the mind. But it's always associated to the body and mind. And the same applies to oneself. Does that make sense? That even in your dreams, actually, right? Like, when we grasp at ourself, right? Like, if you have a, let's say you're in a dream and something, you have a bad dream, a nightmare, and then you're upset, right? And when you feel, oh, I'm scared, right? Still, you're actually, in the dream, there's a body appearing, right? And you're grasping at that body as me, you know, and then your consciousness is there, and you're grasping at that as me, right? And then if something bad happens, you're grasping at the sense of, oh, I'm scared for me, right? But it's not, even in the dream where your actual body is not what it is appearing to you, there's an appearance of a body, and right, it's like your physical body is laying in bed, actually. But you're grasping at an appearance, mainly of your mind, of course, in a dream, but there's even an appearance of a body, right? And then you grasp. Mm-hmm. It's never independent of those things. That's what he's getting at there. And part of the reason I was mentioning subtle is even in the deepest, even in deep meditation, actually, right? If it's not a meditation realizing emptiness, there's this kind of awareness appearing to the person, and there's a subtle level in which they feel they're grasping at that as the basis of I, right? It's not, so there's always some appearance, a subtle, it could be a subtle appearance of a consciousness, it could be gross body, but there's always a basis of body and mind that we're grasping at. That's the basis, and it's related to our sense of I. That's what he's saying here. And that there's never an appearance of an I completely separate from an uncompounded, unrelational thing that's the I that has no relationship to the body and mind. And if you think of your entire life, right, the arising, abiding, and ceasing, right, you go through your entire history in this meditation, right, you can see how, well, as a kid, when I was crying, I was grasping. That I that I was grasping at was my body and mind, right? When I was happy, when I was sad, when I was learning in school, when I was in relationships, when I was eating and drinking and traveling, right? You can't even think those things without, it's related to the body and mind, right? When you were learning, well, it's mainly your mind, right? When I was eating, it's mainly my body. When I was traveling, it's both, and so, it's always both to some extent, but we're focused on different parts. But we're always, the I is always appearing in dependence upon the appearance of body and mind. Never independent, yeah.
That was about an experience I had a few years ago. I fell, I fainted and fell on a stone floor. And what happened next was that I was aware, I was watching, I was aware there was a woman lying on the floor and there were men kneeling around her, tending to her. And I was just looking at it, like from the level of the ceiling of this place where it was. And I thought, oh, it was sort of dispassionate. Oh, that's interesting. There's this woman on the floor and there are these men kneeling around her. And then eventually, at some point, I realized, oh, that's me. And at that moment, the consciousness went like zoom back into the body, and I wasn't any longer up above observing the scene. I was in my body, and then I would come out and go, oh God, what just happened? So how does,
It's interesting.
yeah, it was some sort of, very temporary separation of,
The mind from the gross body.
yeah.
One point is that's kind of sort of. I mean, many people have had those kinds of experiences,
Right,
right?
right.
Some people during near-death experiences, or during fainting, or during. Some people have had it during sleep, for example.
Mm.
There are various states in which people have that experience, and actually, according to Buddhism, actually, whenever each time we go to sleep, in some sense, that happens. Like our awareness, right, continues, but it temporarily is. The way they say it is that the karmic relationship to the body at a time like you're describing, actually, according to I've heard Tibetan Lamas asked about this, and what they would say is that the karmic relationship to the body has not ended. So the consciousness is still related to that body, of course, that's why you would go back. At death, that relationship ends, for example.
Right.
So there's still the karmic relationship of the mind, between the consciousness and that particular body. So they're not unrelated yet, which will happen eventually, because we all die someday. But that it's normal that there are times where the consciousness separates from the body. Sometimes it's sleep, sometimes during near-death experiences, or faint, or unconsciousness, or accidents, things like that. There are many times where people, even during trauma, but I guess this was a minor trauma, but other kinds of trauma, people have that experience. And so at that time, what's interesting, and it's interesting in your experience, right, that actually, when you were sort of dispassionate, right, your sense of self was connected to the awareness
Right,
that was seeing.
right,
So there was a sense of, subject-object, like, oh, I'm seeing these people
right,
and this woman, right? So there's a sense of I connected at that point to the consciousness, and then once you labeled, oh, that's me, to that body, then of course the sense of self became again connected to that body. So it was like, and that's what I was saying earlier, how sometimes we more emphasize awareness as our what we identify with, and sometimes the body more is what we identify with. So that story, I think there was obviously a kind of an emphasis on the consciousness at one point, but then once you said, oh, that's me, meaning the body, right, then you identified, your sense of self became you could say that the body became the basis upon which your sense of self was labeled, and then your identification went to the body more. So it's that would be the description, I think.
Is that the moment of seeing emptiness?
No. And actually, Lama Tsongkhapa will go into a lot of things, many subtle things that we think are emptiness that are not emptiness. And later in this text, in the next few pages, he's going to get into many different experiences that he's saying, are not emptiness. And he points out that emptiness is quite difficult to realize. And actually, this is related, so I'll say the next paragraph here. Lama Tsongkhapa. Now, I want to actually just pause a moment and look at this paragraph, because Lama Tsongkhapa says here. Now he's talking about this particular reasoning, but also the whole sequence of reasonings, and he says, you should train in order to gain firm certainty, which sees that such reasonings damage a self existing inherently different from the aggregates, because you have not induced the pure, crushing certainty with respect to the two sides of sameness and difference. The conclusion that persons do not inherently exist will be a mere thesis that you do not gain, so that you do not gain the pure view. And this is getting a little bit, it's not exactly what you were asking, Rajiv, but it's related. So Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, and he's going to go into more detail about this, is, this kind of meditation, where you're meditating on emptiness, it's not enough, and it's not going to work, actually. It's not going to be effective, is what he's saying. If you just like memorize these reasons and say, okay, if the self existed, it would be one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates, it's not one with the aggregates, it's not different from the aggregates, it doesn't exist. Right? What he's saying is essentially that's almost useless. That won't induce experience, right? And he's using these, again, like, we've been going through this text for a while, so I hope you're starting to get a sense of Lama Tsongkhapa, right? On the one hand, he's an amazing scholar and a precise person, and he's also a yogi, right? A meditative master. And you can see this here, he's saying, because these terms he's using, firm certainty, and then he says, a crushing certainty, right? Like, so what he's getting at is that and this is why I was giving these examples, right, is if you're really meditating on this, right, first of all, that sense of the object of negation, right, we got this earlier, it has to be very, it's not, how does he say it? It's the innate one, right? And we said innate means it's as fundamental to you, it's like, actually just yesterday I was at a class, I work as a psychologist, yesterday I was at a class where we were talking about the different parts of the brain, you know. I'm not getting into neuroscience here, but it's making a point, like, you know, they were pointing out, you know, there's a part of the forebrain, the neocortex that's unique to humans, right? And there's the limbic system, which we have in common with mammals. And then there's the brainstem, which we have in common with reptiles. And the reason why I'm just mentioning that as a side, it's not Tsongkhapa not saying that, but part of it, I'm just bringing that up to say, this meditation has to be all three. It has to engage all three. And sometimes people, when they meditate on emptiness, they're only doing it with their neocortex. In other words, like it's an intellectual exercise, which at the beginning it can be, right? Because you want to understand the points. That's your neocortex, I suppose, actually, isn't it? The point that's doing the logical analysis is your neocortex. But what he's saying here is, it's got to influence you down to that instinctual level that you have in common with reptiles. Like it has to impact you. That's what he says, crushing certainty, right? It's like, I'm sorry, say it right. It's that you have to have brought up, first of all, that object of negation at that instinctual level. Does that make sense? Like, so you know, it's an instinct. That's what he means by the innate eye, right? An innate eye is the eye that goes from life to life. It's a sense of self-grasping that continues even when you die, according to Buddhism. That continues even when you're unconscious, when you're passed out, right? That continues even when you're in deep sleep. You know, it's that fundamental, the sense of, you know, it's always there, the sense of grasping at a self, right? So my point is that when he says crushing certainty, firm certainty, right? He's getting at that, he says induce a pure crushing certainty, right? So what he's saying is, first of all, you have to identify the object of negation on that very innate, that's the word he used, right, innate. So innate is like not just intellectually acquired, right, that's what he was saying. It's something more fundamental than that, right? And then when you're doing this analysis, right, you have to do it in a way, let's say right, like he's giving you the logical points, but you have to relate it to your own experience, right? So you have to relate it experientially to, like, you know, and it's like, that's why I was saying, it's like, wow, you know, you have to recognize the sense of in which, you know, they give these examples, right? Like, say it, like, you know, like when somebody says something to you and it upsets you enough that you can't sleep at night, right? Like you get so upset, right? Or when something happens to you, like I say, or even worse, like even more visceral, right? Like some kind of accident happens where you feel you almost died. You know, there's a sense of that's like, say right. It's like it feels. Lama Zopa says it feels as solid as the Rocky Mountains, right? That's the way Lama Zopa sometimes says it. He's talking experientially, right? That you feel that you're identifying. So I mean, at the first time you do this meditation, you're just trying to understand it. Of course, you might be going, okay, well, he's saying this logic and that logic, and how do I understand that logic? So I'm just using, again, Lama Tsongkhapa is not using neurological terms. At that point, you're just using your neocortex, right? This uniquely human part. And you're doing this analysis, which we need. Actually, it's very important. But as you go deeper and deeper into this meditation, when Lama Zopa Rinpoche says it's like the Rocky Mountains, it's that solid to you. Or, you know, they give these examples. Think of the time you were most upset, right? Or they, you know, Khensa Rinpoche said they took the monks and they like on the cliffs in the Himalayas, and they would like dip as if they were going to fall down the Himalayas and then sit down and meditate, right? Or the people who go to the graveyards at night and get terrified and then meditate. You know, the point is they're trying to get at this very instinctual level of self, right? And then you apply these things like, you know, well, I you know, so like if it was the one where I almost died, right? You're having some, well, then, you know, then you're doing this meditation based on that. Well, what do I mean I almost died? Right? Is that one with the body and mind, or separate from the body and mind? Right? It's very hard, and you have to hold that object of negation as you're meditating, and you have to apply this reasoning to your. And it's not at that point. It's not it's not like if the self, like at the beginning, it's like some theoretical idea that seems out there, right? If that self, almost like, the way Plato would be looking, these ideal forms. But when you get deeper into this meditation, right, it's like, it's this incredibly, what's the word, innate, instinctual sense of self that you have yourself, right? And then you're analyzing, is that one with the body and mind, or is it separate from the body and mind, right? And then you're analyzing that specific, you might use that experience, right, of somebody insulted you, or you almost died, or some other thing happened, or you failed at something, right? You fail at something, you feel, oh, this is terrible for me, right? Well, okay, that me, what way does it exist? Is it one with the body and mind, or is it other than the body and mind, right? And you would keep doing that, and part of the point here is that you would do that so deeply. Does that make sense? That's what he's getting at. You would be analyzing this so deeply and so experientially that there would come a point where, as he's saying, there would be a firm and pure crushing certainty that I, and it's that specific I. It's not saying you don't exist, right? That, and also he's going to get more into that, but at that point, it's not saying you don't exist, right? But it's saying that I, that's the object of negation that I've been looking for, that's self-established, inherently existent from its own side independently, doesn't exist at all. Does that make sense? And you would come to a crushing certainty of that. And he's saying, and if you don't do it that way, then he says, it will be a mere thesis. See what I'm getting at? A mere thesis. Isn't that an interesting phrase? And you get the sense of what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying here, right? It'll just be some mere thesis, right? It won't be, you won't gain the pure view. That's the phrase he uses, right? So gaining the pure view is not just some thesis. Does that make sense? It's a crushing certainty. It's an overwhelming experience, actually, is what he's saying. I mean, overwhelming is the wrong word, but it's a utterly transformative, maybe that's a better way to put it, experience. And I want to make one more point here, because we're not talking even about the direct, at this point what we're talking about is what they call conceptual realization of emptiness, which means it's not direct realization of emptiness, it comes from the path of seeing. And again, sometimes people think, I just think it's a problem linguistically in English or something in the West. When we say it's conceptual, we think that means like, how do I say it, intellectual. If a lot, here we're talking about, when he says you gain the pure view, right, gain the pure view, he's talking about a conceptual realization though, of emptiness, right? Not a conceptual idea of emptiness, but a conceptual realization. And in this, now, of course, the direct realization of emptiness is deeper and more transformative than a conceptual realization. That's true. But here what he's saying is, this is conceptual and it's that deep, right? Because actually, like, according to Buddhism, the moment when you've been most terrified in your life was conceptual. The moment you've been most madly in love in your life was conceptual. It was conceptual is not intellectual, that's my point. In this context, conceptual means, let's see if I say it right, means that it's related to the conceptual mind, right? So as long as you have, so in other words, that there is still concepts involved, but concepts are not just intellectual ideas. Does that make sense? Like, and one way of saying that is animals have concepts from this perspective. Does that make sense? So they're not talking about intellectual when they say conceptual. Like if an animal, like when an animal, actually, I'll give, just to give an example of what I'm talking about, like if an animal felt attacked and we're gonna fight back, right? The animal has a subtle conceptual concept of self and other, right? I am being attacked by you. That's conceptual, right? If an animal wants food and it's going towards food, it's a sense of this conceptual. I want that food. Does that make sense? It doesn't use those words, but there's clearly conceptuality there. So there's subject-object dualism, and there's a subtle kind of conceptuality. So again, I'm just pointing out, it's that visceral, that's the point. Like it's a level, that's why I was talking about those levels of the brain, is that it's not just a mere thesis, right? It means it's not just an intellectual exercise. It's a level of meditation that's getting at, that's using all those parts of ourself.
So, I answered what you said. So the negation needs to be not just intellectual, it needs to go well beyond that during what you're conceiving.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it has to be much deeper than a mere intellectual exercise. It starts as an intellectual exercise, but if you're going to actually meditate on this, it has to go deeper and deeper. And that's what he's saying. So he's saying you have to train, right? You should train in order to gain a firm certainty, right? So that training means that when again, if you just read this text and come to this class and then you just go, oh, that's interesting, and it's not one of the aggregates, it's not other than the aggregates, that's the beginning point, right? But remember, like, there's this idea that there's the wisdom that comes through listening, right? So that would be like reading and thinking and talking here about this, right? Then there's the wisdom that comes through contemplation. That's already much deeper, right? There you're actually bringing up your own experience, and you're contemplating these reasonings in the context of your own experience, your own history, your own experience in the moment, your own imagination, your own sense of yourself, and all that. And then comes the wisdom through meditation, right? Where you're single-pointedly focusing on that in a deeper meditative state. Anyway, so that you get the point. And then he says,
Dr. Lam,
oh yeah, sorry.
I had a question on that self. Earlier you spoke about the innate part. So there's a difference between the innate I and the learned I,
Yep.
or the conditioned I. How do we differ between the two? The first process for that would be to actually understand the compounded I thoroughly in all senses, if and when it arises.
What do you mean by the compounded I?
The learned I. I'm Rajiv, I'm somebody's son, somebody's this, I work at some place, and so on and so forth. That has to be totally understood as well before you can get to the innate I.
Actually, so just to differentiate, when he's using those terms, like there's the innate, and we call it sometimes the acquired,
Right.
or something. In the way Lama Tsongkhapa is using the terms, the acquired I would be, what's the way to say this right? Like an understanding of the self, in this case, that's been learned through an intellectual, philosophical, or cultural, conceptual framework, I would call it. And so traditionally that would be like, so say somebody was, and actually, I'll give an example. So that would be like if you grew up in a certain culture and learned that, if you learn that like who you are is an immortal soul, or who you are is really just a mere, epiphenomenon of material processes, right? Or who you are, they're all different conceptual frameworks. My point is these are all different conceptual frameworks, right? So if somebody grew up in one place and they, the self is just an epiphenomenon of matter, and somebody else would say, oh no, it's an immortal soul, and somebody else would say, no, it's a it's just the consciousness, infinite consciousness or something. And somebody else would, so they're all different like conceptual ideas. And so the acquired one are these like sort of intellectually acquired ideas that you either learn through formal study, if you went like to some place where you studied that, or it could be also that you learned it, for example, from your parents, or in a church, or in a mosque, or in a temple, or in a, so it could be like things like that. Whereas the innate one is instinctual. That's the way I would differentiate them.
And so an event has to happen for that instinct to come, like falling off the cliff or...
No, those are just extreme examples. But the instinctual one, they would say, is always there. It's always, the instinctual or innate self-grasping is always there. But we use these extreme examples as ways to get at it, in a way. So I say, in a way to notice it more, because it's there often in a very subtle way that we're not aware of. And so we use these examples like being insulted, or almost dying or being very upset, as a way to sort of see it, because it's so, it's like, I'm using my own metaphor for that, but there's often people say, like, like, we don't notice the air, right? Or a fish doesn't notice the water, because it's always there.
Right.
So then, it's only when the wind blows strongly suddenly I notice the air, right? Like, something like that it's always there, but we have to do something more, we have to bring up initially more extreme examples in order to identify it, that's all. So then Lama Tsongkhapa says, settling that the mind does not inherently exist. So he says, when you have thus sought with reasonings whether the self does or does not have inherent establishment, you negate the inherent existence of the self by means of your failure to find it as either one or many. At that point, through the reasoning that analyzes suchness, you will not find an inherently established mind, just like, for example, when you do not observe a barren woman's son, you will not observe his mind, such as his eyes. Right, so there, first of all, what he's getting at here, you remember at the very earlier on, we were talking about the root of cyclic existence is the, what did we call it? The sense of I and mine, right? And so here we're getting at mine. And what he's saying is, if how do you refute mine? That it starts with, if you've refuted the self, then of course there can't be, if you refuted the inherently existent self, then there can't be something that inherently belongs, that it belongs to an inherently existent self. So that's like a natural consequence. And he uses an interesting metaphor. He says, like a barren woman's son, right? I mean, somebody, what's a barren woman's son is somebody who doesn't exist, right? So he's saying, you can't talk about what's the eye color of a barren woman's son, because they don't have eyes, right? And so, you get the point there? Does that make sense, kind of? And then he quotes again Nagarjuna, if the I does not exist, how could the mind possibly exist? And then he quotes Chandrakirti, since without an agent no actions exist, therefore there's no mind without a self. Therefore, by seeing the I and mine as empty, the yogi is completely liberated. And the point here is that if you realize experientially, right, the lack of it, the emptiness of the inherently existent I, and then the emptiness of the inherently existent mind, you're free of the view of the transitory collection. That's what the term we used earlier, which is the root of samsara, right? And so this is the way to achieve nirvana, or liberation, is the realization of the lack of, emptiness of self, lack of existence, or emptiness of the inherently existent I, and then mind. And in this case, mind mainly refers to my eyes, ears, nose, my mind, but it can also refer to belongings. We talked about that in another class. Like, mind in this sense is not just your belongings, but is also, my body, my mind. That gets refuted. Pause there. So, actually, I want to say let's pause now. We sometimes do this. I want to take because I think we're covering a lot of material, aren't we? And it's quite deep. Because we could keep going very quickly, but actually, maybe I'll finish this next paragraph and then we'll take a short, like a 5-minute pause or something. So he says, thus, those reasonings settle that the I is one's that the I of one's own continuum, apprehended thinking I, or self, or the person, does not exist by way of its own entity. Right? So point being, again, these are very subtle points he's getting at now, and he's going to get more and more subtle as we go on now. Because what he's saying is, it's not that the I doesn't exist, right? The mere I, but the I doesn't exist by way of its own entity. And then he says, through them, you should also realize the entire meaning of the suchness, which is the selflessness of persons. That all persons, from hell beings through Buddhas, and all their mind, are not inherently established as one entity with, or a different entity from, their bases of designation, their contaminated or uncontaminated aggregates. Through those reasonings, you should know how all their mind is likewise established as without inherent existence. So he's getting at very subtle points, isn't he? One is that he's saying, this is true of all beings. And he's saying, even Buddhas. right? It gets a little bit at the question that Lisa was asking before, or is that even a Buddha, right? That's why he says contaminated or uncontaminated. That even a Buddha, and he says basis of designation, right? So there he's implying, what's it says, right? That a merely labeled, merely designated self does exist, right? Every kind of being, a hell being, you yourself as a human or a Buddha, has a basis of designation that's either a pure or impure. Buddhas have pure aggregates, is what he's saying. We have impure aggregates. Hell beings have impure aggregates. And what he's saying is, there's the appearance through dependent origination of there's a mere appearance, and then a designation, a label, I. And that I exists as merely labeled, right? As a mere designation. But then he's saying, in terms of inherent establishment, that's the term he used there, right? An inherently established self never did exist, doesn't exist, never will exist. It's totally empty. So he's getting at a very subtle point, right, which is that if you meditate on this, you'll eventually realize or understand, right? You'll come to some kind of recognition of that. That it's very subtle, isn't it? So the self exists as a mere designation upon aggregates. Right? But it doesn't exist as one with those aggregates or as separate from those aggregates. It doesn't exist as self-established. It doesn't exist as established from its own side. That's what he's getting at there. Right? And actually, in a few pages, he's going to point something out, which is, and if you find that difficult to grasp and understand, good. Like, because if you think you understood it too quick, in other words, what he's saying is, that's incredibly difficult. Actually, he says this later. It's incredibly difficult to truly understand that. Which is why, if it were easy, you would already be liberated from samsara. Does that make sense? And so if you're finding it difficult, that's a good sign. And if you're struggling to understand it, you're saying, well, how can things exist as dependent designations? And how can the self exist conventionally while being empty and not, and what does it mean that there's a self that there's a merely designated self that exists, but the inherently established self doesn't exist at all? These are subtle points and difficult points, and he's saying it should be difficult. It is difficult. And then we have to think deeply. This is the process. Does that make sense? Of learning this topic. Actually, okay, so because this is such a, I just want to suggest that. So that ends that section. I want to suggest this. Let's take a 5-minute break and then come back, and let's do questions and answers. So I want to suggest this. Think about questions.
Well, no, it doesn't. I think the trick becomes you have to decide which of the three. I was trying to find